Well, welcome once again to our Wednesday night Bible studying of Daniel. And we always start our Wednesday nights with prayer. And I would like to do the same thing tonight. I'd like to say thank you for letting me go this weekend to my son's wedding. And thank you to Pastor Autumn who preached. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who's making these live streams happen and working so hard. There's so many people working behind the scenes to put all of it together. And I just want to say thank you. Let's start with prayer, and let's all pray together. I know there are a lot of prayer requests that I don't know about, and a lot of them that are unspoken for whatever reason, whether we just can't say it or somebody we've been praying for a long time situation. So let's just all pray together, all right? Just pray. Father God, we love you. We are so grateful for the opportunity to be able to pray and just to come to you, just to close our eyes and bow our head, or even talk while we're driving down the road in the car, or outside in the sunshine, or even sitting on a porch in a rainstorm. God, you are with us no matter where we go, what we do. You're an amazing God. And it's such a privilege for us to bring our requests and our concerns to you. But first we want to say, God, how great a God you are. You're amazing. And we praise you. We praise your name. We thank you so much for being a God who cares for us and watches over us. For a God who loved us so much that you came and you gave yourself for us so that we could have a life with you now that has peace that passes all understanding, and a life with you forever in heaven, which we can't even comprehend at this point. But you're an amazing God. We love you. We praise your name. And God, I do know that there are so many that are sick and making trips back and forth to the hospital and struggling with diseases that have been around for a while, and cancer and some heart disease and other issues that are going on. And God, I pray that your hand of protection and your comfort would be on them, that they would know that you're with them in that hospital room. And God, I pray that they would be able to get out. I'm thinking of Rob right now. I pray, God, that his time with his son this week would be a great week. And I pray for protection over Mike as he travels up here from Louisiana. And God, there's so many. I'm thinking of Donna Wilson and Jerry Perry's mom, and the list just goes on and on. And God, I pray for each and every one. You know their name, you know their situation, you know where they're at. And God, I just pray that you would just watch over them and keep your hand on them. I thank you, God, for our country, even though right now we're in quarantine and sometimes it feels like our liberties are being stepped on and the Bill of Rights is being thrown out the windows. It's still the best country in the world. And I know it's because it was founded on Christian principles and that you've had your hand on this nation. And God, I know we've tended, as a nation, been turning away from you and not paying attention to you, a lot like our Bible lesson today that we're going to study. But God, I pray that you would have your people just to cry out and humble ourselves and call on you, and that you could heal our nation. Help us to be the people you want us to be. I pray for our leaders. I pray for our president. I pray for our governor. I pray, God, for wisdom. God, you say you put people in power and you take them out of power. So, God, help us to be who you want us to be. I pray for our church. I pray for wisdom as we start to look toward the end of this quarantine and what to do and how to do it. And I pray that you would give people a peace and a sense to know that they can trust you, and help us to be courteous to each other and mindful of each other's worries. God, you know some people we're ready to just go do what we used to do, and others are still, no, let's wait a little while. So help us to be considerate of each other and love each other. And God, I just pray for wisdom in that area. I pray for the leaders of our church, your church board. I pray for all the different ministry leaders that are still working so hard to do ministry with the different age groups. Pray, God, for those families that have lost a loved one. I'm just thinking of some that I contacted yesterday that lost a loved one and this is the anniversary, or the anniversary just passed. And when those days come, God, you know how hard it is on the families, loss of grandchildren or husbands and wives. God, it's dads. It's hard, and I just pray that you would touch these families, touch these people. Just be with them. God, I pray for those unspoken requests that we talked about. Pray for people who are struggling with finances at this time, that you would just provide for them. You provided man in the wilderness. You can provide for our needs now. I pray for our unsaved loved ones, God. I thank you for the fact that 3 times as many people are watching online to services and Bible teaching. And God, I pray that your word would not go out and come back void. You tell us it won't, but I pray it would be effective. I pray you'd use us, use our church. May it grow your kingdom. God, we love you. I thank you for the way you've helped us to reach out and to reach more people. And I pray, God, that you continue to just keep helping us to do that. I pray, God, for all those that are still doing small groups and meeting one-on-one. Pray you bless their time. Watch over them. Keep them safe. I pray for our frontline workers, our nurses that are in the hospitals, and doctors, and our policemen, and people who have to be close to an area where it's dangerous, it's risky. And I just pray for your watch care over them as they take care of so many people. I thank you for the news that our hospitals are a third empty and things are going well. And God, I just pray that you continue to watch over people. You know why this pandemic, this COVID-19 is here. And God, I pray that you would just be God. You're sovereign, and help us to learn and grow closer to you. I want to thank you for the time I've heard from families that this is a time when they've grown closer to each other and actually sat down and had game nights and talked and sat at the table and eat dinner. And God, I pray that a lot of these things that we're doing, finding time to be in your word and praying on a personal level, that we would not forget and we would not stop doing it. If life gets back to normal, when it does, God, help us not to go back to the way it was. Help us to remember what we need to be doing with our families and with you and with studying your word, and may we never stop. We love you. I thank you for your word. I thank you for what it teaches us. I thank you for the wisdom that's in it, and what we can learn about who you are and how people are. And the people then are the same as the people today. We still do the same dumb things. We still make the same mistakes. And I pray, God, you'd help us to learn tonight as we study Daniel. Help us to learn the mistakes, and may we not repeat them. God, we love you. And I just pray you'd help us now as we study chapter 5. And I pray it all in your name. Amen. Well, thank you. Thank you for praying. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 5 this evening. And Daniel chapter 5 is about a guy named Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. He didn't take over right after Nebuchadnezzar. When Nebuchadnezzar died, there's like 3 or 4 different kings that take over. In fact, I wrote down here, Nebuchadnezzar served from 605 BC when his dad died. Remember, he was a general, and he was actually right there in the Middle East. Just got done with Egypt and was back at Israel when he heard his dad died, and he had to take off back to Babylon. So he took over in 605, and he died in 562. And in 562, someone else became king, a guy named Marduk, and he served from 562 to 560, only 2 years. And then after him, Neriglissar, I hope I pronounced that right. He served from 560 to 450 or 556, only 4 years. And then after he died, and by the way, these people are being assassinated and taken over, pretty corrupt, pretty violent stuff going on. A guy named Nabonidus became king, and Nabonidus had married one of King Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, and he became king from 556 to 539. Now that time period is exactly the time right here. In fact, 539 is when Belshazzar is sitting as king. And so you're probably asking me, how can Belshazzar be king if Nabonidus was king? Well, Nabonidus is Belshazzar's dad. So Belshazzar is actually the son of Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. So it's his grandson. And they're co-reigning. Nabonidus is not in Babylon. Nabonidus is actually in Arabia. In fact, he spent the last 10 years in Arabia. Some people say that he was probably out fighting against the Medes and the Persians, but more than likely he wasn't. If you read the commentaries on that, there's a difference of opinion. But he stayed in Arabia. He'd been there for 10 years. In 552 BC is when he went there. So he's been there since 552. So that's a little over 10 years. And so his son, he left his son in Babylon and said, here, you reign from here. If you have any trouble, let me know. And so that's why Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, is actually called the king here. You'll notice as we read that he promises to give anybody who can interpret this handwriting on the wall that we're going to read about, they could be the third highest ruler in Babylon. Well, it's because he couldn't give away the second, because that's him. His dad, Nabonidus, is actually the first king. He's co-reigning with him. That's second, and so the third. So it all fits if you understand all that. The Medes and the Persians have been in war against Babylon, and they've been conquering a lot of the area, and they're right up against the city. And Belshazzar still, instead of going out on the battlefield and fighting with them, they just locked up the city. And as I read about the city, it had 17 miles of wall all the way around the city, and the river Euphrates ran right straight through the middle of it. And the river went through this tunnel, and it was so far nobody could hold their breath or swim that long. And there were bronze bars hanging down in the river, so even if you got swept in there, you were going to get stuck against these bars, and it just meant certain death. And so as I read the commentaries on this city, they say the walls were almost 100 feet high and 20 feet thick. Some of the commentaries got a little crazy with that stuff, but with the water, with the river running through the middle of it, they say they had food stocked up in the city that they can handle a siege for up to 20 years, which is a pretty long time. So if Cyrus, and history tells us that Cyrus, Persian, was outside and had this city under siege, he probably realized right away, this ain't going to work. I can't sit out here for 15, 20 years waiting on them people to run out of food. So he's going to come up with a different plan. In fact, the plan that Cyrus comes up with, now remember, the Medes and the Persians have joined together to conquer Babylon and to take them over. The plan that Cyrus comes up with is he's going to divert the Euphrates River. He's going to dig canals, and he's going to then fill in the river with gates or dirt or rock to try to stop it and make it go down these canals. One commentary I read said that the historians say that he started flooding a low area, a swampy area, started diverting. They dug through so it would go that way, and they only had to divert it for a short time. They're going to actually divert the Euphrates River to get the water level to drop low enough that his guys don't have to swim. They can actually walk down through there. Even if they're a little bit wet, they can either walk or ride their horses right straight through this tunnel and go under these bronze gates, and when they get inside, they can open the gates. So he left his troops, some of his troops at the north end of Babylon and the south end where the river went in and where it came out, and he took the rest of his troops north, and he said, go up there and divert the river. And then there were troops waiting outside for the gates to open. And sure enough, when the water was diverted and the water went down, they went through the tunnels and they opened the gates and let the Persian army in, and they just walked right in. They didn't even have to fire a shot. They just walked right in, all their arrows still in their quiver and their spears, and the city was taken without even a battle. In fact, this was spoken about in Jeremiah, and Jeremiah remember, lived from 626 to 586, and this is taking place in 539 BC. The story we're going to read today takes place in 539 BC. So So we're talking 50 years after Jeremiah. Jeremiah said this was going to happen, and here it is 50 years. You think they would have maybe read it and said, we're not going to let what Jeremiah said is going to happen. It talks about how the city was going to be taken in a day. But it says, because of Belshazzar's feast and taking the implements out of God's temple. Remember, we're going to read about this. Nebuchadnezzar took the gold articles out of the temple of God and put them in his temple, to his God. He didn't use them. In fact, it would have been a blasphemy against his own pagan God to take articles. They always took them from the temple of the people they conquered and put them in the temple of their God to show that our gods are stronger than your gods. And Nebuchadnezzar never used those articles, but Belshazzar is just going to throw caution to the wind and just blaspheme even his own God, basically. But he's probably trying to make a point that my God's better than your God. I'm not sure. He was just blatantly irreverent toward the holy God. And Psalms 14:1 says, the fool says in his heart there is no God. And that kind of sums up Daniel chapter 5. We're going to study it now. But it kind of sums it up because Belshazzar is a fool. In fact, Daniel pretty much calls him that right in front of 1,000 of his nobles and all their wives. He says he was a fool because he just blatantly spit in God's face is what basically has happened. I want to go to, just before we start, I want to read some of the stuff that Jeremiah said was going to happen to Babylon. And I'm going to start in Jeremiah chapter 27, verse 6 and 7. And it says this, now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So this is Jeremiah talking about God and how God has given the land to Babylon. He says he's my servant. And remember, God said Nebuchadnezzar was going to, for 70 years, Babylon was going to rule and then it was going to fall. If you go back and look at history, and we studied this in Ezekiel, Babylon came into power in 609. What did I tell you today's date was? 539. 70 years exactly. And so it's going to be a nation for 70 years. The people were taken off into captivity in 605, and it's going to be Cyrus that gives permission. If you go look at Nehemiah, he gives permission for the people to go back. So the exile is going to last for 70 years. The temple is destroyed for 70 years. Remember, it was knocked down in 586, and it wasn't rebuilt until 516. So it looks like there's a bunch of 70-year increments going on here. But from 609 to 539 is 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I'm in verse 6 of Jeremiah 27. And it says, my servant, I have given him over to wild animals of the field to serve him. Remember, we talked about that in chapter 4 when he disrespected God and tried to get so proud that God made for 7 years him go out and eat grass like an ox, and lost his mind. It says, all the nations shall serve him, and his son and his grandson, until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings will be there. So Jeremiah actually said that God is going to let Nebuchadnezzar serve, then his son, then his grandson. So this is his grandson, and he says at the time of his grandson, all the nations are coming at the end of Babylon. So it's going to play out exactly like God told Jeremiah to write it down. That was 50 years earlier that Jeremiah said at the time of his grandson, Babylon's going to fall. Then if we go to Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 1 through 3, it says, the word of the Lord spoke concerning Babylon, the land of the Chaldeans, through Jeremiah the prophet. Declare and proclaim among the nations. Proclaim it and lift it up. Lift up a standard. Do not conceal it, but say, Babylon has been captured. Bel, that's their god, has been put to shame. Marduk has been shattered. Her images have been put to shame. Her idols have been shattered. For a nation has come up against her out of the north. That is the Medes and the Persians are coming down from the north. It will make her land an object of horror. There will be no inhabitants. Both man and beast have wandered off. They have gone astray. So let's go to verse 9. This is, remember, 50 years before it actually happened, God has given Jeremiah this prophecy. In verse 9 it says, for behold, I'm going to arouse and bring up against Babylon a horde of great nations from the land of the north. So Medes and Persians, great nations from the land of the north. 50 years ahead of time, God has given Jeremiah a glimpse of what's going to happen. It actually, in verse 24 of chapter 50 of Jeremiah, talks about how there's going to be trickery involved on how they're going to take over by the lowering of the river. It's going to be a surprise. It says, I set a snare for you. You were also caught, O Babylon, while you yourself were not aware. You have been found and also seized because you have engaged in conflict with the Lord. So when Belshazzar took those sacred vessels, those sacred things from the temple, and said, I'm going to disgrace them. We're just going to have a wild party, which is what they were having with them. God says, you've entered into a conflict with me, and you're going to be captured, and King Belshazzar is going to be killed unaware. It's going to come upon them unaware, which is exactly what happens. Now, if we go to Jeremiah, I'm almost done. I know we're supposed to be studying Daniel. I just found it very interesting that Jeremiah told all this stuff that was going to happen before it happened. Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 11 says, who's coming? I know we said it was nations from the north. I got to find it here. Verse 11 talks about the Medes. It says, sharpen your arrows, fill your quivers. The Lord has aroused the spirit of the kings of the Medes, because his purpose is against Babylon to destroy it. So God is going to send the Medes. It says, for it is the vengeance of the Lord's vengeance for his temple. So God is going to repay them for what they did to the temple and the fact that Belshazzar is disgracing the instruments that were used in the temple. Verse 28 also talks about the Medes. It says, consecrate the nations against her. I'm in verse 28 of chapter 51, Jeremiah. The king of the Medes, their governors and all their perfects, and every land of their dominion. So Jeremiah, 50 years earlier, said the Medes were coming. So the nations from the north, the Medes and the Persians are coming against Babylon. 39 actually talks about the conditions on which they're going to attack and take over the city without a fight. It says, when they become heated up, I will serve them their banquet. Now, when we start reading Daniel chapter 5, we're going to find out that they're in this great banquet with thousands of his nobles, and they're drinking and they're having a wild party. So they're having this banquet, verse 39 again, and I will make them drunk, that they may become jubilant and may sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake up, declares the Lord. I will bring them down like lambs to the slaughter, like rams together, male and goat. So they did. They came like lambs to the slaughter without a fight. Excuse me. Cyrus took over the city of Babylon without even a fight. In verse 41, it says how Shishak has been captured, and the praise of the whole earth has been seized. That was Babylon. How Babylon has become an object of horror among the nations. So they were at this feast, and God said, you're going to go like a lamb to the slaughter. Without even a fight, they're going to take you over. And that's exactly what happened. Verse 53 in chapter 51 says, though Babylon should ascend to the heavens, and though she should fortify her lofty stronghold. So this verse is talking about how strong the city of Babylon is. But God says, my destroyers will come to her, declares the Lord. In verse 58 talks about the walls and the high gates of Babylon. And again, this is 50 years before God says they're coming down. Thus says the Lord of hosts in verse 58, the broad wall of Babylon will be completely razed, and her high gates will be set on fire. God told Jeremiah, write it down. It's 50 years before it's going to happen, but I want people to know that when it happens, I'm the one that did it. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't by chance. So God knew that the day was coming. 70 years was the time that God let Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon be in charge, and God puts leaders and nations in charge, and then he takes them out. Who's sovereign? God is sovereign, not Belshazzar. But Belshazzar thinks he is invincible, and he's the one that gets to decide his own fate, and he doesn't. And he's going to find that out in a hard way today. So let's start with Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar, verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast. Now, I've already told you Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And Nabonidus is his dad, and he's co-reigning with him. His dad's out of town, okay? He held a great feast for thousands of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the thousand. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Let me stop right here. It says Nebuchadnezzar his father. It's actually his grandfather, but it says father because that's the way they spoke. There was no word in their language for grandfather. It's just father. That's why even in Jesus' day they say our father Abraham. That's just the way they talked. He was a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. Also, they're worshiping Bel, which is their god. In fact, Belshazzar has their god Bel in it. When he called for these vessels to be brought in, it was probably in direct defiance to the God of Israel. He's probably doing it on purpose, just to honor his own God, Bel. But he was drinking with them. And if you go to Proverbs chapter 31, 23, 20, it says not to drink. It gives strong warning against drinking alcohol, but specifically say kings aren't supposed to drink or they're not going to be thinking right. And also, kings weren't to drink with other people. They weren't even to associate with them. But Belshazzar is kind of, maybe he's had too much to drink already, but he's kind of throwing all that stuff out the window. Maybe he's having this party to get everybody to relax. I mean, the Medes and the Persians have surrounded the city. They're right there, and he says, we're safe, don't worry. And he's trying to put on a good face and let everybody know. So maybe he's doing things to the extreme to get their mind off the fact that they're going to be stuck in the city for what he thinks could be up to 20-year siege. But he knows they're not going to wait that long. They're going to go away by then. At least that's what he's hoping. Plus, men and women, they wouldn't have these parties together. If you go back to the book of Esther, remember the book of Esther when Xerxes was having a party with all the men and then he called his wife to come in? The women wouldn't have been in there. And because they were in there, that tells us that this party was not a party that we would want to be at, not to mention the drinking, but there was probably a lot of sensuality there. There was stuff going on there that we wouldn't want to have anything to do with, but it was a wild party that he had going on. And he was trying to make a point by using those articles from the temple of the Lord. He was trying to make a point of Bel, his God Bel, versus the Lord God of Israel. Verse 3, it says, then they brought in the gold vessels they had taken out of the temple of the house of the God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So they're actually taking the vessels from the one true God, the God who created everything, and they're using them in defiance to spit in the face of God to say our gods are better, and they're gods that were made from the created stuff, gold and silver and wood and stone. And while all that was going on, it says, suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand and that did the writing. So he can see the back of the hand and these fingers. This finger's actually writing on the wall. He's not holding a pencil. The finger's writing on the wall, and he can see the back of the hand. I guarantee you everything got quiet at that point. Whoa. Everybody got quiet. In fact, the king's about to sober up immediately. The king's face grew. In verse 6, the king's face grew pale. His thoughts alarmed him. His hip joints went slack. In fact, if you go back to the original version, in fact, some of the versions that you guys are reading tonight will say his loins went loose. That means he messed his pants. His knees went slack. And they started knocking together. He just lost control. He is so afraid of what's going on. In his mind, he might be saying, have I crossed the line? Maybe he's not putting together what's going on, but he's scared to death. In verse 7, it says, the king called aloud to bring in the conjurers and the Chaldeans and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Remember, third ruler, he has to be third ruler because he's co-ruling with his dad. a lot of the commentaries I read, Daniel's not there. Daniel's been put out. When Belshazzar comes in, he didn't keep the same wise men as Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe Marduk, the next king, did or didn't. But over time, he's like, I don't want to hear your wisdom. I don't want you around to tell me what's right and wrong. I want people around me that'll say what my itching ears want to hear. Do you think that could happen today? That people, they'll attend a church only if that church says what their itching ears want to hear. They don't really want to hear the truth of God's word. They just want to feel good about themselves. And he knew that if Daniel was around, that wasn't going to happen. So he's probably got all new of these diviners. Maybe they're not all new, but he's trying the same old thing. And people today do the same thing. When they start to run into trouble, they run to the world. They try the same old things. And God says, I want you to turn to me. I'm the one you can count on. In good times and bad times, whether things are going great in your life or bad in your life, I want you to turn to me. I want you to trust me. And a lot of times, God has to allow us to go through some tough times to get us turned back to him. And I think I've said this before, but statistics tell us today that there are 3 times as many people watching online church services and Bible studies than have ever watched online. 3 times as many. So people are seeking at this point, which is good. But in verse 8, let's go to verse 8. It says, Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. So what happened when he went to the world and he tried all the same ways to figure out what to do in life? The same thing that always happened. No, they couldn't read it. They couldn't understand it. Although Daniel's going to be able to understand it by the power of God and by the Spirit of God. They can't. Now, whether God just blocked them from seeing it, maybe they could read the words, that the words are mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, and it's, let me see if I can get to where it's at here. Here it is over here. Mene means numbered. So numbered, weighed, divided. Numbered, weighed, divided. Maybe they could understand that it said numbered, weighed, divided, but they couldn't put it together. They couldn't give the answer. Maybe the king knew it said numbered, weighed, divided. What does numbered, weighed, divided mean? We don't know. So they couldn't answer. They couldn't give the king an answer. And so they were so upset. The commotion was so upset. The king was so pale that word finally got to the queen, which is probably his grandmother. Maybe it was his mom. Maybe it was King Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. It could have been King Nebuchadnezzar's wife. All right, it was one of those two. So it's the queen mother. And verse 9, let's go there. It says, Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his face grew even paler, and the nobles were perplexed. In verse 10, the queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and the nobles. So she heard the commotion. She heard the words. She figured out what was going on. She knew something was happening. And the queen spoke. I'm halfway through verse 10. O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. So she's like, get a hold of yourself here. I got a solution for you. I got an answer. In verse 11, it says, There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. She's telling her grandson or her son about Daniel. She was there. That's how she can give this answer. She was there when Daniel interpreted 2 dreams for King Nebuchadnezzar and told him that he was going to go and live in the wilderness for 7 years and eat grass like an ox. And she was there when Daniel helped put King Nebuchadnezzar back on his throne and get his kingdom back to him. She saw Daniel at work when God was working in him. That's how she's able to tell Belshazzar this stuff. She says, like the wisdom of the gods were found in him, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father or grandfather, remember there's no word for that, your father the king appointed him chief magician over the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. So she's given him a history lesson. She said, there is a guy, and your grandfather gave Daniel a position of authority. He's been taken out of that position either by Belshazzar or his dad, one of the two. But she says, this is In verse 12, let's go. It says, this is because of an extraordinary spirit of knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in Daniel. So she's saying that he could solve difficult problems. He could come up with the answers when nobody else could, and it's because of the spirit that lives in him. She recognized the spirit living in Daniel. People should be able to see the spirit living in us. If people can't see the spirit living in us, then we don't have the spirit living in us. We need to get on our knees and say, God, I want your spirit living in me. I want you to fill me with your presence. I want you to be seen on the outside. She saw the spirit living in Daniel. She could see that God had his hand on Daniel's life. And she's trying to tell her grandson or her son, we're not sure if she's the grandma or the mom, she says, she's trying to tell him, you need to talk to Daniel. It says, found in Daniel, I'm halfway through verse 12, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. So she said, just find Daniel. If you find Daniel, all your questions are going to be answered. And so they sent to find Daniel. And I stopped right there and I thought, what was it like while they were waiting? Do, 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 do. Was it total silence? Did the king say, somebody play a tune? No, I bet they just sat there. Quiet. People going, I don't know. Whispering going on in the corners. Not sure, but finally they find Daniel. And I want you to know that it's been 70 years since the exile. This is 539. It's not 70 years since Babylon became a nation. Daniel was exiled in 605. So he's been there for 66 years, plus whatever his age was. So if he was 16 years old, 17 years old, he's in his 80s, all right? He's in his mid-80s right now. He's not a young chicken anymore. And Daniel is brought in verse 13, and it says, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you the Daniel who is the one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers, some commentaries, let me stop there, I'm at verse 15. Some commentaries say that the king was making fun of him because he was a captive. I don't think he is. I think he's legitimately asking Daniel, are you the Daniel that I've heard about? Are you the one that's been able to come up with all these answers? So he's asking him, I've heard about you. Are you the guy? And he says just now in verse 15, the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard, he personally has heard from, first of all, his mom or his grandmother, which would have been a young girl or a wife at the time this stuff was going on, but he's heard it before this. We're going to find out that he has heard this before now, okay? He has heard these stories. He knows. I personally have heard about you, I'm in verse 16, that you are able to give interpretation, solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make the inscription known to me, you will be clothed in purple, you will wear a gold necklace around your neck, and you will be given authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Belshazzar only has one thing to offer Daniel. And he says, Daniel, I'm going to give you a position. You're going to be wearing purple clothing. I'm going to give you a possession. That's a gold necklace. And I'm going to give you power. I'm going to make you the third ruler. Those are the things that he can offer, and that's what he does offer. What do you think Daniel's going to say to that? Probably the same thing that Abraham said to the king of Sodom back in Genesis chapter 14 when he went and rescued Lot and all the people and brought them back. And the king said, keep all the booty and I'll just take the people. And Abraham said, no, I'm not taking none of your stuff, because then you'll say, you made me rich instead of my God taking care of me. And Daniel's going to give the same answer. Daniel's going to say, I don't want your stuff. Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said to the king, keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. He said, I don't need your stuff. In fact, Daniel respected Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel does not respect Belshazzar. He doesn't respect him at all. He said, you can give it to somebody else. I don't want any of it. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to you. So he says, I'm going to tell you what God says, but I don't want your stuff. And then in verse 18, he goes on to say, O King, the Most High God. So he's going to talk to him about God. God has granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to King Nebuchadnezzar, your father. So God's the one that gave it to King Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19, because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples and the nations and the men of every language, they feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wanted to kill, whoever he wished to spare is alive, and whoever he wished to elevate, and whoever he wished to humble. So what Daniel is saying is Nebuchadnezzar could do whatever he wanted because God gave him that power. He gave him that position. He gave him that grandeur. He put him where he was. Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became proud, that he behaved arrogantly, he was disposed of. He deposed of his royal throne and his glory and was taken away from him. Now this is talking about chapter 4. It says he was also driven away from all mankind. His heart was made like that of the beast, and his dwelling place was with wild donkeys, and he was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, and he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he sets over it whomever he wishes. So at the end of verse 21, he says, King Nebuchadnezzar got proud, like you right now, Belshazzar. Basically, that's why he's giving him this history lesson. And he says he was disposed, he was taken out into the wilderness, he ate grass like cattle, he acted like he was insane for 7 years until God put him back. And then he learned that God is the one who puts people in position, and God is the one that governs over the affairs of mankind. So he just gives them this history lesson, but verse 22 is very key to what this chapter is about. So I want you to pay attention to it. Verse 22, this is Daniel getting right in Belshazzar's face, right in front of 1,000 nobles and their wives. So there's a few thousand people in this room, and Belshazzar is sitting there, and he says, yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. So Daniel is saying, Belshazzar, you already knew this story. You already knew this, and you're still spitting in God's face. You already knew this, and you're still not worshiping the one true God. You already knew this, and you're still doing whatever you want to do. You're not giving your life to God. You're not serving God. You're serving yourself. So he's basically saying you already knew this. In fact, that takes me to Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through 20. And I got it sitting here in the NIV. And I've been reading out of the NASB, but I got it sitting here in the NIV. Listen to what it says. This is the New Testament, and this is Paul talking about people already knew this. Just like Daniel told Belshazzar, you already knew this. Though you already knew this, you still went and did your own thing. Though you already heard these stories, you still went and got those golden chalice and those articles from the temple, and you defamed them. You just spit in God's face. Even though you already heard these stories, you already knew. Listen to what it says, verse 18, Romans chapter 1. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. That's exactly what Belshazzar was doing, suppressing the truth by his wickedness. Even though he already heard the stories of what God had done and who God was. Verse 19, since what may be made known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature has been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Even today, people are living their lives the way they want to live it, doing what they want to do, serving themselves, blaspheming God, taking what God has given us and using it in an unholy way. God has given us our life. And it just keeps popping back into my head when Jesus said during that last week in Jerusalem before he died on the cross, and the Pharisees were trying to trick him. They were testing him, and they said, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And he said, give me a coin. And he took the coin. He said, whose picture's on this coin? And they said, it's Caesar's. He says, then give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but give to God what belongs to God. Whose image was on the coin? Caesar. Whose image is on our life? We are created in God's image. So we are to give our life to God. Our life is to be given to him, a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to him. And yet we take what God has given us and we use it in an unholy manner. We live lives that are godless and unrighteous. We live in sin. We may even be coming to church, but we got this secret sin and we're using what God gave us in an unholy way. This is God speaking to us saying, it's time for you to clean it up. It's time for you to clean it up. Verse 23, it says, but you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and you have brought in the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles and your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine out of them, and you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, they do not hear, and they do not understand. So he says, you're worshiping false gods. Basically, what he's saying is, you are guilty of premeditated sin, and you're guilty of being a fool. Talk about boldness. Daniel is going out and he's just telling it like it is. This is preaching that I pray every church will preach the truth of God's word with boldness, even if it offends people. It could cost him his life. You don't normally just tell the king, you did premeditated sin and you're an idiot. You're a fool. But Daniel's going to say that. It says halfway through verse 23, it says, but the God in whose hand you are your life breath and all your ways you have not glorified. God is holding, Daniel says, God is holding your breath in his hand. Your life is in his hand. When he says you can't take another breath, you're not going to take another breath. In fact, at the end of this chapter in verse 30, I got a line drawn over there. It says, that day the king Belshazzar was slain. Today's the day that he's not going to take another breath. Belshazzar has no idea that he has gone past the point where he could be saved. He could turn to God, but he's out of time. In verse 24, then the hand was sent from him. This is Daniel talking about the hand that was writing on the wall. It says a hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Have you ever heard, this is where we get the phrase, you ever heard somebody say the handwriting's on the wall? That came from here. It was easy for us to see it was about to come to an end because the handwriting was on the wall. It comes from these verses right here in Daniel chapter 5. He says, now this is the inscription in verse 25. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And this is the interpretation in verse 26. The message, mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put it to an end. In 27, tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. So your days are numbered. How about your number is up? You ever hear that? You ever hear someone say, well, my number is up? I'm going to go, when my number's up, you can't stop it. That comes from the same thing. We get so many of our phrases from today here. And then you weighed on the scale and found wanting. In Job chapter 31, verse 6, it says, God, weigh me with some honest scales. So I don't want to be found wanting. I want to have given my life to God. I don't want to have taken back what God has given me to use to serve him and to glorify him and to build the kingdom and use it to glorify myself and to build what I think would be a kingdom here, which would be nothing compared to God's kingdom. So I like Job, I pray that I'm weighed on honest scales, and I pray that God shows me what he wants me to do and keeps me in the center of his will. In verse 28, it says, upharsin, but Daniel says, Perez, or your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. So Daniel right there says it's been given over to the Medes and the Persians, which are outside. Daniel's probably heard the stories. And I know he's read Jeremiah because he knew after 70 years they were going to go home. So he probably read in Jeremiah that it was the Medes and the Persians that were going to come years before they came. Daniel's an old man now. And here he stands once more in the court of the king and telling the truth, just as bold as he can. In verse 29, it says, then Belshazzar gave orders to clothe Daniel with purple, put on a necklace of gold on the neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that he would now have authority as the third ruler of the kingdom. Daniel probably said, whoopee, it's only going to last for a few hours because this kingdom's going away, and it's going away tonight. Maybe Belshazzar was thinking, if I do this, maybe God will postpone it. I mean, when Nebuchadnezzar got the word that if he got proud, his kingdom would be taken away. It was 12 months. It was a whole year before it happened. Maybe Belshazzar thought he had more time than he did. There are people today living lives that think they have more time than they do. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. So if the Holy Spirit is speaking to you right now and he's showing you an area of your life that he wants you to clean up, there's a hidden sin, there's something he's been telling you, stop this or start doing this, and we're not doing it, we don't know how much time we have. So I'm telling you, we need to take care of it now. Now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. We need to turn to God. And verse 30, it says, that same night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom about the age of 62. So Cyrus might have came in and taken it. I don't know how many years it was until Darius came and took over, but they were working together. The Persians are the strongest, but Darius the Mede, it looks like, is put in charge. I got to read you a little song. I actually found this hymn. It was written in 1877. It was put in the Morning Star newspaper in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1877. It was written by a guy named Noel Shaw. And I'm going to read it. I want you to listen to what it says. It says, at the feast of Belshazzar and 1,000 of his lords, while they drank from golden vessels, the book of truth records, in the night as they reviled in the royal palace hall, they were seized with consternation. 'Twas a hand upon the wall. 'Tis the hand of God on the wall. Shall the record be found wanting, or shall it be found trusting? While the hand is writing on the wall, see the faith and the zeal. We're talking about Daniel here. See the faith and zeal and courage that does dare to do what's right, which the Spirit gave to Daniel. 'Twas the secret of his might. The Spirit's the secret of our might too. Listen to what it says. It goes on. This is a hymn written in the 1800s. It says, in his home in Judea, or a captive in the hall, he understood the writings of his God upon the wall. It doesn't matter where we're at. We need to be studying God's word so we understand God's writings, so we know what God is saying to us. Daniel, that song is saying it doesn't matter where Daniel was, he could understand the writings. Why? Because God was in him. The last verse, it says, so our deeds are recorded. There's a hand that's writing now. Sinner, give your heart to Jesus, to his royal mandates bow. For the days are approaching, it must come to one and all, when the sinner's condemnation will be written on the wall. I wonder if God's hand is writing on the wall about our heart, about our life. And if he's writing about our life, what's he writing? It's a good time for us to just stop and say, God, I want to make sure I'm in the center of your will. This is a great verse for us not to just take what God has given us and use them for ourselves, and use holy things for unholy purposes. Let's pray. Father God, we love you. Thank you for your word. I thank you for this book of Daniel. I thank you for the lessons we can learn from a foolish king, Belshazzar, who just threw caution to the wind and decided it didn't matter that the enemy was at the door, that he could trust in himself and his high walls. And God, I pray that you'd help us to trust in you no matter what. Even when times are good, God, help us to lean on you. I pray, God, that you'd help us to evaluate our heart. Search us, God. Know our hearts. See if there be any wicked way in us. Anything that you want us to get rid of, or something you want us to do that we haven't been doing, God. Help us to picture that you are writing on the wall all the things in our life. Help us not to be found wanting, God. Help us to be found trusting. I pray it all in your name. Thanks again for joining me for the book of Daniel. I love this study. I'll see you next week.